Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries. I'm your host, Lucas Curcio, and today I'm here with author Jeb Smith, and he wrote a fun book to read, Missing Monarchy. So this is a great book. I picked it up on Amazon. I forget how I found it, Jeb, but it was one of those fun books to read, and just something that just kind of broke up my normal pattern of what I usually read, like in terms of theology and biographies. But thanks for coming on the
Mhm.
show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely, my pleasure. Was it so? This was not your first book, or was this your most recent book?
Most recent book. Yep, this is my fourth book, second on history.
Okay. And what's your background? Is your background in history or theology?
As far as college training, I have none. It's all my personal interest and hobbies, and I've had a love of history since I was young. And it really started with the Civil War. I started digging into material and views that didn't align with what I'd been taught, and I just kept digging deeper and deeper into that. And the two areas where I feel the largest misconceptions Americans have are the American Civil War and the Middle Ages. And so those are my two books that I focused on. I had a lot of time to study and research, as I'm sure you saw the citations,
Mhm.
that I really dug in deep with this book, especially, and uncovered a lot of things that are just fascinating to me. And I kind of hyper focused on it
Mhm.
and took off.
Yeah, I could definitely tell from like the start because you talk about that journey too, how you went down. I don't know if you use the word rabbit hole, but that's what you went down. Actually, I think you
Yeah.
might have used that
I,
word. You did.
yeah. At one point, it's a different section in the book. Kind of, I was referring to my crazy political opinions. Where they've ended up now is going down, the rabbit hole and
Yeah, yeah.
into
I
the
guess I should have
madness.
mentioned the book is correcting misconceptions about the Middle Ages, medieval kingship, democracy, and liberty. And so you really do cover a lot of topics in this book because it felt like it was like half about monarchy in the Middle Ages, and the other half was your critique of democracy and capitalism too. So it's
Mhm.
definitely, I mean, for many people, they would consider this, controversial book.
Right. Yeah.
I am wondering, like, did you get a lot of pushback from this? Like, do people or were people upset with you?
You know, not so far. There's a lot of people that will just dismiss it right off, as I would have. Like I say in my intro, I would not have entertained someone who's arguing for monarchy over democracy, or specifically America, because in my mind, America was kind of the Constitution and the founding fathers were the ideal for me for a long time. And so there's most of the rejection comes from misunderstandings, because a lot of people, one of the main misconceptions that I try to correct, as you know, is that medieval kings were tyrants, and people have that idea. When I try to criticize democracy or point certain things about our political systems, people, they're not willing to. They think the only other option is authoritarianism, some sort of dictator, because that's what they think. The only other possibility is they associate monarchy with dictatorship. And so that was a big thing. I'm like, wait a second, look, guys, that there's a certain time period, especially, where it's very libertarian. Kings were limited; they had far less power than today, and it's a whole different viewpoint of politics. But people, if you can get past that original objection, people have been very open and said, "Yeah, you know what? We have a lot of problems with our system," and they did a lot of things back then. So it's when people are willing to dig into it, I haven't had a lot of pushback at all. Maybe some of the Christian aspects that I come from upset certain people, but you know,
Yeah, because you are a Protestant, right? You're
yes.
not okay, gotcha. Yeah, because, let's kinda talk about, going that direction. So, you're right to point out, like, people, they hear the word monarchy. That
Mhm.
does seem very like, "Whoa, what are you talking about? Dictatorship." And so you want to go into that off the bat and just say, "It's not
Right.
what you think." So, let's talk about, like, the Dark Ages because, there seems to be, again, like, when we use the term Dark Ages, like, that off the bat has a negative connotation.
Yeah.
So, like, how would you correct that misconception when we talk about the Dark Age, the Middle Ages? It's actually, it wasn't bad, and you want to say, I mean, correct me if you're wrong. Is it fair to say that you would say it was actually better than it is today?
Well, I think in many ways it was
Mhm.
better today. And overall, if you're coming from a libertarian and a Christian perspective, I think then yes, it is better. I think the mindset of a lot of people today, they like collectivism, they like a powerful central government, and so they may my hope is, and so far it's been this way, they come away reading, yeah, the Middle Ages weren't nearly as awful as I thought, and they had some good ideas, even if I still prefer our modern system. And that's kind of all I'm really aiming for, is kind of presenting the Middle Ages as they actually were, and saying there's a lot of good stuff here, and we can dismiss what was bad about it and reject what's bad about today, kind of mix it together, and we'd be able to come up with something better than either time period. You mentioned earlier that the book is really two books in one. It's a critique of modernity and democracy, and it's also a defense of the Middle Ages as a whole, but especially the political systems was the main focal point of that. And I felt like the book really needed both of those, because a lot of people don't see the negatives of our system today or democracy. And I really want to point that out, because it kind of elevates kingship. It makes kingship look better when you can point out the negatives of democracy, and vice versa. You point out the positives of kingship, and it kind of brings down democracy. So I really felt that those had to go together to give everyone a real honest evaluation, a defense of the Middle Ages, and of a critique of our modern system that's not as great as
Yeah.
it's portrayed. There's so many things that I used to think were true that I feel are self-evidently clearly false, but it's just in our mindset that we assume certain things about democracy or our political system that are not true. And I feel like I was really blinded. Every society has their own taboos and myths that they kind of just accept without thinking about. And so I wanted to point those out to the modern reader as well. That would open
Mhm.
them up to, okay, kingship is a possibility, or I like this about the Middle Ages.
Well, I think it's interesting because when we hear the stories like Narnia, Lord of the Rings,
Yeah,
these are all about kings,
yeah,
and, I don't know if you alluded to that, but it is right to point out, it's like none of us are thinking, "Oh, what a monarch," like that Aragon, like, how dare he? Or Aslan, like, he was a
right.
king, but it seems like in a form of a government, we are trained to think that way, that, the opposite would be a democracy, or a constitutional republic as we are,
Mhm.
'cause, it always bothers me when people say we're a democracy. I'm like, that's not actually that's technically not true. We're a constitutional republic, but I mean, there's democratic features in it. But Jeb, what would you say? So, like, what would be the argument for you to give to say, let's start with the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were actually good. Like, how would you start by trying to tell people, hey, leading them to, because it seems to be, or is it fair to get again to say that this is from the Dark Ages necessitated a monarch, and that was the whole system, like a top down structure.
Yeah, I would say the opposite. I think modern
Mm.
system is very top down, especially centralized governments in modern democracies today. And I would argue that, yeah, we were a constitutional republic, but we changed over time. And I think there's a specific event, if you get into my other book, where that occurred, where we transformed to where we're primarily a democracy today. And you listen to the politicians in America, Democrat and Republican, they will refer to us as a democracy, even though all the founding fathers despised democracy. You won't find one good statement by one of the founding fathers about democracy, which is, like you're saying, they created a constitutional republic, but it's no longer that way. Um, as far as an argument for the Middle Ages, I'd say it was the opposite of top down. It was bottom up, which is why I like it. It was organic, it was decentralized, and the king really did not have power. The further you go from the people, the less power there is. So all the power is with the people in their law and their customs at the local level. And as I say in my book, it could be one village is very libertarian, the next one's Republican, the next one's Democrat. And people move and live with people like minded individuals, and they form society and they form those laws. And the king, because it was a very Christian society, the king was a servant to the people. He was not above commanding them, creating laws. He was supposed to serve and protect his people, and he's guarding their customs. So the ultimate authority is with the people and their customs, and the king only serves them. He's not a top down. That came with the return of Roman law during the 14th century, where we started looking at kings as lawmakers and monarchs and above people. At this time, they're just a member of the community, like Deuteronomy 17 says a king should be, and he's serving the people. So it's that would be my argument, is consent. that the people were the authority, and you could move with like-minded tribes and people and live under the laws and customs, and the government serves you. Whereas today, you could vote Republican and Democrat gets elected. They're going to pass a bunch of laws that you have to obey, you have to follow. You don't have a choice. You're underneath it. You're forced to obey. And consent is so big to me. I get that from Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, that to search for that one ring and try to force everyone else under your own political structure, whether you're on the right or left, is itself, I believe, an evil. And that's all democracy is a fight for power to conform everyone to whoever the majority wants you to be. Whether you agree with them or not, I don't think that's the correct thing to do. In the Middle Ages, it was completely different. The people chose their customs laws. They even traveled with them when you went from town to town. And it was a whole different mindset of consent and not a force. And that's the main aspect of the Middle Ages that I like.
Yeah, because you mentioned the word king comes from kin, right?
Mhm.
And so he's just a ruler of his people, and so he's holding up the laws and customs and traditions. And you say also too, which is interesting to point out how these kings weren't gonna kind of just go out of control and AWire because the king had this instilled within them that they can't basically like anything new is just rejected. Like it's all about
Right.
again their customs, their traditions. So this is like a safeguard to keep them from going tyrant on the people because if they did, you pointed out that people would rise up and just take them out of power, right?
And it's not just the people. It's kind of the peasants, the vassals they'd unite against them. The church would unite against them. Uh, and that's where I think there's a big difference between a Christian society and modern secular society. Because a Christian society, as I say in my book, they see laws deriving from God, like the Ten Commandments, so it doesn't change over time. There's certain laws that God put in the people and into nature, and those are to be followed and not manipulated. So the past is where you look for governance. You don't. If a man is creating law, he's putting himself above God's law, above limitations. He's creating his own law. He's saying, I want things this way. He's now in rebellion against God. And I quote, a lot of the leaders in the Middle Ages and church officials who are saying, you do not follow a tyrant, because that's what a tyrant does. He's dethroned God. He's put himself in his place by trying to pass his own laws or doing something outside of what the people's customs call for. He's no longer a king. He no longer has authority. And you're supposed to, by the law, you're supposed to reject them. It's in their law that if someone tries to violate the law, a king or something, is part of your law to now disobey him and go against him. And so there was no legislation, because man's not a creator of law. It comes from the people from their past and from which derive from God. And so that's their self-government, and that's set in stone. And so you go hundreds, thousand year with no legislation, no adapting the law, because it's out of the whole entire mindset. Whereas in secular society, man kind of rules. In democracy, he gets to decide what's right, what's wrong, what a man is, what a man isn't, or tax, do anything he wants, because now he's the authority. He doesn't have limitations on him as a Christian society would put.
Yeah, so can you explain like how does that feudal system or how did the feudal system work then? Like what was the form of, besides the king, like like you mentioned vassals and knights.
Mhm.
So how would you explain the feudal system?
Well, I mean, it differed in time and place, but a lot of people will point to France as a fully developed feudal system. And so, as a general rule, you have the king who really only ruled his royal lands and his family lands. So he could rule maybe 5% of all of France. And he has his vassals in there that respond to him. So he's kind of the highest level. He distributes land and titles and power and gives out gifts to his vassals, and they all own autonomous realms underneath him in different parts of France, let's say. And then so they're kind of the second tier. They're higher up lords. And same thing with them. They'll have vassals underneath them that they've distributed sections of their land to, who also govern autonomously in their section. So it's kind of like a federal, state, county, town, that's somewhat the division. And normally what it is a vassal will have to serve his lord regardless of where he is on the hierarchy. usually military service, or it might be money or agriculture and things of that sort. And it kind of just passes down along the line. When you get to the lowest level, the peasants and serfs, generally they're in agricultural work and they provide food for their lord, who's generally a knight or a lord of the manor. And he has time to train to become a great knight and use money to get equipment, and he's their protector. And likewise, he can be mustered by the vassal above him who distributed land to him, and he'll probably owe military service to that lord. But I mean, there's not the regulatory state that we have today. You're basically free. You have your certain obligations. Maybe you're a peasant and you owe your lord. I think I quoted Mark Morris, historian talking in England, that they'd own their lord 20% of their agriculture. And that's basically their governance. They don't have, laws telling them how they are to live, how they raise their kids, how they manage their own property. They're simply giving food, produce to their lord, who's their protector, who's providing a service to them. He gives them equipment. It's a consenting deal. And outside of that, you don't have a whole lot of you're living free in many ways.
So is it almost like each like there's a bunch of mini states like even like not in terms of like 50 states in America, like you got New Jersey, Vermont, New York. It seems like there really wouldn't be that. There would just be a bunch of mini towns almost. Like, is that
Right.
correct?
Yeah. That's some of them are towns, monasteries own land, dukes would own land. They all differed in size. And that's the thing, I gave some of the examples. Like, I think Northern Italy alone had 200 different, autonomous city states. Ireland, I think, had 300 realms they were all broken up into. So some of them were larger sections of land, but they were, it varied quite widely depending on place and time. But yeah, they're really generally autonomous of each other. So and that's the other thing about feudalism. The king only interacts with his direct vassals. So 99% of the population over 99% has no interaction with the king directly. He only has his deals and agreements with those vassals. And then they only deal with the vassals beneath them. So the normal person's only dealing with his direct lord, who he's chosen to follow and agree to the customs or whatever deal they have there. They could live autonomously as well, and they're not interacting with the rest of the hierarchy. So it's very they're not connected as we are in modern political systems. They're very autonomous, but maybe one person in this realm over here is connected to his lord, who's on halfway across country, and they have a deal, but it doesn't affect the people within the actual place. So it's really localized governance
And
and
so
not
you could
interconnected. There's certain people that are interconnected with certain
Mm,
obligations, but it's not like your culture as a whole is connected to the rest of France. If you have,
yeah.
this little autonomous realm or dukedom or
And so you could basically then just go because I remember how you pointed it out in the book. Like you could basically just kind of just come and go as you want. Like say like you didn't want. I mean, like I don't know how. Like was it common for people to do that? Because I'd imagine that how would you go into another town or city and be granted a piece of land? Like would you not have to have that given to you? 'Cause then you got to work the land and you technically don't own the land.
yeah, it happened quite often, but a lot of people generally stayed where they grew up because that's like their family, that's their customs, that's who they are. They're comfortable in that area. So there wasn't as much travel, obviously, as today. But you could go on if you went to a town. It depends. I mean, if you're a serf, you could leave your manor and you could go to a town, and then you could be set free after 1 year. There's other ways of getting
Mm.
your freedom as well, or you could join the church, or your kids might do it as well. But all the land is not owned in some way by the Lord. That's more of a theoretical thing. So there's a lot of just simple villages, and people come into them either through friendship or they purchase land, or there's a lot of unused land is really what it is at this time. So you have large sections of land that may be owned by a lord or may not, and you move into the land and you make an agreement, and then now you're working. You pretty much own the land, live by yourself autonomously, and then you may if you did take the land from a lord, you may owe him some agriculture or something like that. But often generations later, it's more of just a bond or a relationship, and it's not even a real feudal obligatory governance. It's more kind of just honor, association, friendship,
Yeah.
and the
How
rest dropped off.
and, so, being that you mentioned things like how the king, can't just do what he wants, like, it's about the law, the customs that he has to upheld. So behind this really, though, is like, is it fair to say that you're not really just arguing for a monarchy, you're arguing for a Christian monarchy? Like, it has to be Christian for this to work. Otherwise, the king could, in all necessary, purposes, go, AWOL and just start, being a despot and whatnot.
In part, I've done some thinking about that. I defended the Christian kingships because I like them and because they do put the limitations on the lords. The church did, and that viewpoint does it. But I'm sure there's other worldviews. Like I want to study feudal Japan that I think was very similar. But a lot of the pagan nations, they worship their king almost as a god or a descendant of the gods, which kind of gave him that divine right of kings, which originated in the 17th century by Protestants, actually. And so that's why he's able to create law, because he's kind of divine himself. So I think it obviously works with a Christian form of kingship to limit the king, because really the law is the authority, and the law is derived from God. So it's really, as they said in the Middle Ages, Jesus is the King of Kings. He's
Mhm.
really the top of the hierarchy, and that prevents man or a monarch or a king from becoming a tyrant. So to me, it's the best protection. It's the best system that I know of to prevent tyranny.
Yeah, because, like, how much would you say the church basically, like, solidified this? Because, there was, this is Reformation, so there was one church, primarily, like, right? Like, it was ruled through, the Pope, essentially,
Mhm.
top, Roman Catholic, think in
Mhm.
those terms. So do you think, like, that today, like, if we did this today, we wouldn't have that same power or structure, because there needs to be a state religion that everybody just agrees upon. Where today it's like, you have, where, through Protestantism, yeah, you got Roman Catholics over here, you have, I don't know, Mormons, Jehovah's Witness. Like, you would need the land to agree upon Christianity and have a unified denominational structure to back this up, and give this, the validness that it needs to be upholding divine rights of kings and laws.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of forcing everyone, especially today, under a Christian form of kingship. I don't think Christ would do it that way either. I think that's why I love decentralization, where everyone could break up and form their own
Mm,
realm. So you could have, a Catholic form, some Baptist form, or whatever it is. Some might allow legislation. People are going to have different views, which is why I don't think we should force everyone into the same thing. Which is why I love the decentralization of the Middle Ages. But yeah, as far as if you were to reinstate a form of medieval kingship today, it would have to be in a realm where everyone agrees. That was very important to their political system, which is why they hated democracy. They want, as Thomas Aquinas said, a unified whole. To them, it's unimaginable to have people politically at war. You want everyone of the same mindset and agreement. You don't want to force people under customs that's going to cause civil wars and infighting and people fighting over power that's going to just destroy your society. And so if you were to do it today, everyone would obviously have to agree with, yeah, we like this form of kingship. I think it can come from all denominations. It's not like it's a whole theological layout of what a king is. It's just certain political ideas of what man is supposed to do, what he's not supposed to do, and what the people are telling. Is the king a servant of the customs, or is he a creator of it and a manipulator of it? And so you don't even have to be a Christian to agree with it. I think there's a lot of non-Christians. I've had non-Christians who have read the book that agree with it politically, even if they don't agree with the Christian
mm.
aspects. So I don't think you'd have to be a Christian, but it comes from a Christian worldview. I think atheist or Buddhist or Muslim can accept a Christian worldview of politics because it's better than secular, even if they're not Christian themselves. But again, I would never force anyone under, or I would not want to see someone forced under a system they don't agree with. I think
Yeah.
everyone should kind of form their own little little kingdoms, autonomous realms where they can choose their own governance.
You mentioned how, because I do remember you talking about that in the book, how the kings and the people, they hated democracy. So like in what way, like why do they hate democracy? Because I never heard that critique before. So like I don't know, like is that something that they spoke about often, or what, or was there interactions where they were just critiquing other systems of government, and why do they hate democracy in particular?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like normal peasants were talking about democracy back then. They weren't, because in that's one of the other things I love. As you know, reading some of the critiques of democracy from the political science studies over the last 5 6 generations. There's a lot of negatives that come with politics. So politics was not in the typical medieval person's mind at all. They were free of politics because as we talked about, the law was set, the customs were set, they were already living how they wanted to live. They didn't need to be involved in politics. They didn't have to vote. They didn't have to campaign. None of that stuff is around. So it's not even not on their mindset. But as far as the more, the theologians and you can go back to ancient Greece as well, they simply saw it as the American founding fathers. You can get it from them on why they didn't like democracy. They saw it as mob rule, and they saw it as not providing self-government because they already had that. They saw it as the opportunity to get the mob to take away your government, to take away your liberty. It simply opens up an avenue for other people to control you and for powerful people to manipulate you. Whereas under kingship, you already have that stuff. Why would you open it up to being taken away? And so they just saw it as, I use the example, if there's two tribes and you have a smaller tribe living by its own customs, and a larger one comes in, forces them under their political system, starts extracting their money, forces them to live as they want to. Everyone would say, oh, that's evil, if they did it by military force. But we do the same thing by voting every single election. And so people would say, why would you open up that thing that's going to lead to wars? Because that was the other thing, it's going to destroy the united whole, and that's going to destroy the community, and it's going to break apart the local community, which was big back then, the extended family. There's a very tribal period where people lived with like-minded people connected by their religion, and you had a very moral, it creates a moral community and a self-sufficient community. And you start putting people at war politically, it's going to tear everything apart, and it's going to cause anger. It's going to divide that community. And we've seen that once democracy and politics is instituted, we've had some pretty massive wars ever since then as people vie for political power. And it often ends with a dictator, which is another one of their warnings, is one of those two forces is going to become powerful enough that they'll completely subjugate the other one, take away all their rights, and institute one of their military leaders like a Hitler or a Stalin, and he's just going to control everything, and everyone's going to be under a tyrant.
So I can hear like people in the back of my mind. So they would say that I'm sure you probably dealt with this, where it seems like to them, again, when they hear the word monarch, they would want to say, well, Jeb, what are you talking about? The monarch himself is that dictator, where we don't even get the choice to all that way. So like what would you say to that? Like why if democracy, because I do remember you making that point, how democracy gives way to these dictators like Stalin, Hitler came up, they were democracies and they got voted in power. Why would democracy lead to dictators, and how would monarchy prevent dictators? More than just again, you got the laws and the customs, because we discussed that. Yeah, so how would you answer that?
Yeah, well, how democracy has led to dictators. If you go back, look at the history of China, Japan, Germany, fascist Italy, all of them, once they started introducing politics, they had multiple parties vying for power. One of them either just goes straight to war or becomes powerful enough that they start passing all the laws and everything to keep the other ones subjugated, and then they control everything. And then when you have a dictator in power like that, he's no longer following the people's customs. he's passing law, because once you introduce the potential to pass law and legislation, you have parliaments. Now the government can control all the people, alter their laws, and it's now a top down. They're doing what's going to benefit them, because there's so much power in democracy and centralized governments. You're going to get the wrong people seeking that power, who want to use it to control everything. So you end up with a dictator who extends his power over the people. As far as a king is not a dictator, because the king, again, is serving the people. He can't become a dictator. He may want to do that. And it's not like people didn't try to do it, but they are by law to be resisted. They've gone outside. So you could have, that's one of the objections to kingship that I hear a lot is, oh, what happens when you get a king who's not very intelligent or doesn't do a good job?
Mm.
It doesn't matter, because the law is very simple. He doesn't interact, like I said, with 99% of the people. He cannot become tyrannical because he has no authority over them. The law has authority over the king, and he's equal under the law as the people are. He's not above it, as are able to manipulate law, like legislations and democracies and presidents and who gather and change law and pass law. He has none of that ability. So he cannot become a tyrant. And once he does, it's in the law to object to him, to resist him, to even kill him. And so there's plenty of wars. Most all the wars in the Middle Ages are, some form of that is, the king's gone outside of, or lord's gone outside of his bounds, and people are resisting him, and then they overthrow him. So under true kingship, it's within the law. It's impossible to have a tyrant, whereas democracy enables tyrants to come to power. It's kind of the might makes right. Whoever ends up winning, whoever's the most powerful, is in power, and then they lord over people in a way that kings never had the
Mm.
ability to do.
I even remember you mentioning too how people, would say that it's unfair that the monarch is just born into it, not voted in, and how you actually said that was a good thing. Can you explain that?
Yeah. Well,
I thought that was
yeah,
interesting.
that's the one thing I actually want to mention is one of the main functions I heard. I forget what historian said this, but from their mindset, the main function of a king is not what he does, because he does not have much function at all. It's what he prevents from doing. He prevents the people who want power over you, the tyrants, from gaining it, which is why I love hereditary inheritance. It passes on only through the bloodline. It gets rid of that whole fight and competition for power, and it keeps everyone who wants power out of it. And so to me, that's the main positive. And I point to different examples of middle-aged rulers who didn't want that power, but they said, I'm here to serve the people. I'm trying to get out of this, but the people want him to do it. He has to do it. And that's how you keep a healthy, united whole, by it passing on to father to son, and you're preventing what could cause fighting over that power. You're preventing people who will want that power from getting it. So to me, that's a main plus of it. And as I said, there's plenty of people in democracy. I'm one of them that I don't want anyone to rule over me. But in democracy, that's kind of forced upon me. But there's no voice for people like me. There's no objection to that, of people being forced against their consent to comply with whoever's in charge, but they have an objection with only certain people coming to power. But again, I mean, it's not a perfect system, but I think it's much better than what we have today, because it prevents a much greater evil of people who want to rule over you achieving that. It bothers me. There's something about it, but that there's politicians out there that want to control their people, or they want to use government power backing for their own benefit at the expense of people, and we give them that chance and we give them that opportunity, and those are the people that fight hardest and succeed most often. And I just think that's an ugly system, and I like a kingship that keeps those type of people from being involved and having that power over us.
How would you compare? Have you done much study in Christian nationalism?
A little bit.
And how how does your view compare? Well, I mean, how does monarchy compare to that? Like, do you find agreement with Christian nationalism, or do you have problems with that?
More I object to it because, again, it's kind of a form of what I'd say true monarchy or dictatorship is. They want to force everyone under this Christian nationalism that a lot of people don't want to be a part of, or wouldn't want to be a part of. And so to me, consent is so vital. And I think that's a biblical principle. I think it's unchristian to force people under a Christian society. I think it should only be for those who want to. And we should display it and say, hey, do you see what we're doing? Maybe
Interesting.
you want to copy it, or maybe you want to come here. Whereas Christian nationalism is just a form of democracy, in my opinion, even though I'm sure I'd like what they're trying to achieve, because I like a Christian society much better than a secular society. I don't, it's not, definitely not something I would fully endorse, because again, it's going against that, it's forcing people to do what they don't want to do, which we
Interesting.
already have now. So
Yeah.
I would see it as an improvement, but again, I could not endorse a system that forces everyone under one system.
Well,
It's
how
just
would
going
that
to be fighting.
yeah, so how would that work then? Like, say, like you got this vision back because even back in the day, like they wouldn't allow these towns to be pagan. So if we're
Mhm.
not forcing Christianity upon people, how would that work for somebody who say, well, let's just say like they're Jehovah's Witness or they're Mormons, like would they still be able to have their cities and their customs, or say like they're Muslims, like would Muslims be able to be in America under this monarch slash feudal system?
In my ideal, they absolutely would.
Hmm.
In my appendix, I write about it, where it'd be that form of monarchy over the whole nation, but it'd be thousands of autonomous realms. So the Muslims would have their section where they're the Hadith and the Quran, they can be guided by Sharia law and all that. And secularists would have theirs, Democrats would have theirs, Republicans, libertarians, everyone would be allowed to have their own self-governing area, but no one would be allowed to force their ways on someone else. And it's just like in the Middle Ages. Um, when in the Crusader states, when the Crusaders went and recaptured the Holy Lands, they allowed the Muslims to keep their customs. They didn't change it. They
Hmm.
swore in the Quran. They had their own, their own laws stayed intact. They didn't force them to become Christian. Or I mean, there were instances of those. It was against canon law, but as a general rule, the Muslims maintained that self government, as they did in Spain, as Jews did in Europe. And even I give the example of Viking pagans and the Christians in England. When the Viking invasions happened, both sides allowed each other to keep their own customs. They might have their new lord now. Again, that's up the hierarchy, so they're not dealing with it. The lord's up here, who's now, say, a Viking lord over Christians, but they're not interacting with them. Their life hasn't changed, the normal peasant. So they go along living as they were the same way. And same when the Christians overtook the Viking villages, the Vikings and the pagans got to keep their customs. They just now had a new Christian lord, but their day to day life didn't change. And that's
Hmm.
one thing, the blind obedience returned with pagan Roman law in the 14th century,
Hmm.
secular law. And Christian nations in Europe adopted that sort of blind obedience. And you go back to the Middle Ages, which I'd say is Christian form of governance, where you allow those people the customs. Heretics were different, because you weren't punished for being a heretic. You were punished for spreading hearsay, because that was I go into this in the chapter on Christendom. Kings were expected, they thought the Bible, they're supposed to uphold a Christian land, and it's already a Christian land, already Christian laws, and a Christian people. And so hearsay is kind of like a terrorist attack from within. And so it's not like them being allowed to have their own place. They're seen as an invasion, a cancer that's spreading throughout their society. And so that was the one place where, yeah, people did not have equal say. But at the same time, if someone was trying to transform one realm, autonomous realm, into the laws of the next autonomous realm, they'd do the same thing. They'd say, there's an invasion. This is our people, our customs. You don't come in here and change it. And wars happen that way as well. So hearsay was just kind of a different form of that, in the worldview of forcing your ways on someone else, or trying to undermine the culture and the society from within. That
Yeah.
united, it's disrupting the united whole, which seen as very dangerous. And then you add on the eternal salvation part, threatening that was kind of above, like Christ was a king politically. Salvation was the main thing needing to be protected in a Christian state. So they did push
Yeah.
back against
I
any
think
threat.
I think that's a really interesting point how you mentioned because I do hear a lot more Christian nationalists talking and not somebody like in your camp talking at all. So I'd imagine your camp is less popular. Uh, But it's interesting because there is a lot of talk of, well, prior to 100 years, everybody just believed certain things, insert Christian nationalist beliefs. But how you mentioned how they would have, like, again, like the Danes would be over here, the Muslims would be over here, they
Mhm,
would still be allowed to uphold their laws and
mhm,
customs. And now that you mentioned that, that does remind me how I do remember reading things in history during that period where you would come across events like that where they would uh, go into these wars and they would come to these agreements. Okay, you stay over there, we'll stay in our land. So I think that's probably a key feature between your monarchy. I keep on saying your version of monarchy, but you're trying to
mhm.
uphold the original monarchy.
Kingship.
Monarchy versus Christian nationalism. Yeah, not
Yeah.
Jeb's monarchy.
One thing that you just remind me of is a lot of Muslims in the Holy Lands would migrate from Egypt to the Crusader states because they had lower taxes. And the sultans had more power in Islam over their people, and they were able to tax more heavily and all that. So that you asked me earlier, who would my form of kingship be for? I think it's better for everyone, but I wouldn't ever force anyone. But Muslims obviously enjoyed it because they had more liberty, they had less taxes under a Christian lord, and that's why a lot of Muslims resisted Islamic expansion over the Holy Lands, and they preferred the Crusader states under Christian lords and didn't rebel. The Christians in the Crusader states were always a minority. The Muslim population could have taken them out at any time, but they didn't want to because they were under the Christian lords. What they wanted didn't change, and they were actually relieved from a lot of taxation and things like that that
Hmm.
sultans would put place on them at different times that Christian lords weren't allowed to.
The question, not to change the subject too much, but before I forget, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the medieval, like when you look at their architecture and like what they built, these beautiful,
Hmm.
breathtaking buildings and churches. It is funny when I look at our modern architect, how it's just really ugly,
Hmm.
depressing, just makes you feel like you're just in this, everything's a box and a square, nothing's beauty. We go and get, again, like going to these churches, look at these castles,
Yeah.
and you're just in awe. And it's ironic because, again, the Dark Ages are viewed as if these people were just like, poor and horrible and everything was so bad. But then you look at their architecture and you think, well, how in the world are they way ahead of us and making these
Hmm.
breathtaking buildings that can't be from a society that was just completely, in the dark,
Right.
to use that term. I don't know if you mentioned that. To my memory, to my knowledge, you didn't
Um,
mention or touch on that, but did you think about that?
a
Using it as an
little bit.
argument?
I think capitalism honestly is affected America, especially. Like if you go to Europe, I think things are more beautiful. I mean, obviously, a lot of it is focusing on the castles and the medieval stuff. We don't have the history, but I think economics is the most important thing in a capitalist leaning society, in modern secular society. So everything's built with that in mind. How am I going to save money? And back in the Middle Ages, like you're talking about the cathedrals and stuff, one objection to the medieval church was how much money it had. And but you look at this and how much money they put into churches, like a lot of Protestants object to that today. But from their mindset, everyone wanted to donate. If they were going to build a cathedral in your area, it was kind of everyone's cathedral, and everyone wants to donate, the Lord, the people.
Mm,
And this is the churches were specifically built to be the largest, most beautiful building in the town because that's what's supposed to stand out. And that's why the arches, they're pointing to heaven. They're saying we're Christ focused. This is the most important thing in our life. And so they'd invest huge amount of money. They also had, I think beauty was appreciated more then, especially among their the Catholicism of the Middle Ages differed from modern, but they appreciated beauty in a way I think a lot of Puritan-minded Protestants in America, especially, don't. And they sought to build it into everything in life, especially in the religious nature, in the artwork and things like that. And they really wanted to celebrate this kind of stuff. They also didn't have all the distractions we have today, like TV, a lot of things that draw our attention away from beauty or focusing on great projects that kind of unite everyone to donate to. And so,
yeah. What do because you mentioned capitalism, and I know you have a big critique towards capitalism. So what do you primarily not like about capitalism, and why would feudalism be better than it?
Well, as far as an economic system, I think capitalism's the preferred system. If you're looking at purely from a financial aspect, I think an economy that's mostly all capitalistic, maybe a little socialism in there would be the best. So I'm not critiquing it financially. I'm
Mm,
critiquing it from what it does to society. And basically, in my opinion, it elevates money above man and puts that as the primary focus, and it puts careers and jobs ahead of people. And since the capitalists took over, which again started in the 14th century with the merchant class, that's when it started to build. They started centralizing everything, and they started taxing everything, and they started regulating against the self sufficiency of what feudalism brought. And so I'm more of somewhat of a distributist, that I want everyone to have the liberty to provide for themselves and not be forced into the capitalist economy where we go work. It breaks apart families because now the father's out of home. He's going to work a 9 to 5 because he has to pay these requirements, these taxes and things like that. He can no longer just provide for his family at home. And same thing, you throw the mom into the economy as well. You have the education system and businesses that are uprooting families, sending them across the country on business trips, which can lead to infidelity. And it's separating the family. It's sending kids off to school and then off to a job in some other town, and that extended family is now broken up. You have people from like everyone today with the extended family. Oh, my brother lives in this state, my dad lives in this state, my sister lives over here. It's just broken apart those close bonds that feudalism encouraged. It kept everyone in that local community of family and friends and like-minded people, and people grew up in a very loving community that I think is very beneficial to people. And it was self-sufficient, and it was libertarian, and it kept people free. It kept them not needing any outside forces, provide for themselves so they can't be manipulated. And capitalism is definitely given us a lot of technological advancements, but I think it's harmed the family, and it's placed money above um, family.
yeah. Yeah. So yours is a quality of life argument, essentially, right?
Right. Yeah. I think we'd be like feudalism, we'd be poorer, but I think there'd be so many benefits. Mental health, crime. I think Christianity, to grow up in a like-minded, close-knit community is very beneficial spiritually, mentally, and politically, I'd say as well, to be self-sufficient.
Would you? So you mentioned like we'd be poor. So like, what would you do then? I mean, I guess that's probably one of my my critiques. Well, if we're poor, what do you do when a tyrant nation comes in and
Right,
they're capitalistic, they're all about the work
right,
and they have all this
right,
technology. Yes, we were enjoying life, but now we're going to be ruled by our enemies because we were, just having a better quality of life.
right.
Y- Yeah. So how would you answer that?
That I don't think I have a good
Mm.
answer. I think that's a just criticism, and I don't advocate to bring feudalism back because it arose organically from Viking invasions and things of that
Oh,
sort.
okay.
It was a military structure. I'm saying I like it politically more than today, but I wouldn't bring that now because we're at a very different starting position. But there's principles that we can take from the Middle Ages as a
Oh, okay.
whole. The feudalism part was more a defense, like because a lot of people view it as like a form of slavery. And I'm saying no, it's very free, and here's why it arose. So yeah, I would not recommend bringing back feudalism completely today. And I think for the same reason, we would be taken over, especially America. We've created a lot of enemies. If we don't keep advancing technologically, we will be subdued.
Hmm. Yeah, you know what? Because this would probably lead to my next question. So, I know that you were, it sounded like right. Just refresh my memory. You started out investigating this because you were investigating, I guess, the Civil War era.
Mhm,
Okay. And so you mentioned how democracy kind of did take over during that period when,
mhm,
the South lost. So, how did you view, because you also said too the founding fathers were against democracy and they
mhm,
they did want a constitutional republic. So did
mhm.
you see the constitutional republic back then as a form of a feudalistic system where you had these, state rights where it was a United States where, there wasn't
Right.
a federal government, it was decentralized. So, are you saying like that's how the constitutional republic was set up, so that each state was functioning kind of just like how it was in the medieval period?
Not the same way, but it definitely had those aspects. The decentralization, it wasn't as extreme as it was in the Middle Ages. But you look at the colonists when they first came over, like the Puritans went to New England, the Catholics went to Louisiana and Maryland, I believe. Um, they separated by religion, and they were all these colonies, which later became the states, were kind of like a large, like-minded section of Europe. And so they created the Union as a compact between the states for protection, not as a centralized power of Washington, D.C., one nation under God. All that started after Lincoln. That was going to now be the, as we have today, which is a centralized democracy, where now the political parties rule. Before that, it was a union. It was expected to be a diverse union of states where the central power did not have much authority, so people could move in between the states to be with like-minded people without enforcing their ways on the other. But obviously, it had democratic aspects of it and Republican aspects, and it allowed for legislation, it allowed for politicians, it had elections. So I think in that way, it's different than the Middle Ages, but they kept that decentralization alive before we turned into a nation under Lincoln. And
Hmm.
yeah,
I was gonna ask, so like, what would you say then essentially changed under Lincoln? Like, was it, it was just like a federal government then, and so now pretty much the state rights are less? Because I mean, it seems like again, like you look at like state of Florida today compared to California, night and day difference. Like, I'd much rather any day of the week live in Florida over California, and you can kind of see that again, I guess like a feudalistic principle in play there. But how would the Civil War, or how did the Civil War, you're saying, change that? Like, what primarily would be the difference, and like why was it so negative? Because it doesn't seem to be that much different. Where again, it still seems like we have this constitutional republic set up versus just pure democracy.
I would say in name we still have the constitutional republic in certain aspects of it, but there's a lot that changed. It's hard to narrow down the biggest thing. I would say the biggest, if I had to, I'd say that before Lincoln, the states could resist the federal government. And you read Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the state said the sovereignty is with the people and the people of the state, and they can throw off, or they were consenting. That's the Middle Ages.
Mm.
They were consenting to the Constitution, but as soon as they wanted out, which would be secession, they were allowed to take back their sovereignty and their nation, which was their state. And so before the Civil War, both North and South, the normal mode was nullification. So if the federal government did something that the states deemed was outside of what the constitutional law was, they would nullify that law. And they'd say, we're not passing that law within our state because we are a sovereign state. We believe you've gone outside of, same way with a king in the Middle Ages. If a king goes outside of his jurisdiction, people were to resist him. We had that in America before the Civil War. And so the states would say, we think you've gone outside of your delegated powers, which the states, delegated to you. And so the states were the authority. They gave the federal government its authority. Same way with the Middle Ages, where the people and the customs and the law, they delegated certain rights to the king who is to serve them. That's how our federal government was originally, in many ways, meant to function. So they would nulligate laws and say, we're not doing this within, or they'd threaten secession, which actually was more common in the North. And after Lincoln, he didn't allow the states to leave. It was no longer a union of consent, and it was no longer sovereignty with the people. That sovereignty switched to the federal government, where the federal government says, no, you're going to obey us. And whatever law the federal government passed, the states have to pass, which the towns have to pass. So all the control is now with whoever has the major political parties in Washington, D.C., can now extend into all those states and force their way. You said there's a major difference from California and Florida. I think there are differences, but not nearly what it was meant to originally be. And if you look at the federal government today compared to before the Civil War, it's not comparable at all what they control. They lived off of tariffs before the Civil War, which was simply taxation on imports and exports. there was no direct tax. Like they would have objected to that.
Hmm.
To the federal government educating us, doing all the things it does today, the dictates it gives. In the union, they would say, no way, that's not in your jurisdiction. And once the power was centralized in DC, it's going to just expand. And now the Supreme Court decides what's legal and what's not. It's no longer the states, and the people are no longer sovereign. We're now told what the federal government can and can't do, which interprets, like you look at the Second Amendment and separation of church and state, that wasn't around for 150 years. They completely flipped the meaning of the Second Amendment around based on a Supreme Court. Whereas the states back then would say, what are you doing? We're not listening to you. They'd have that authority, but now everyone's forced to obey whatever the federal does because it's
Hmm.
now a nation state where a
Would so
majority
if
rules through political.
Well, because you said before too, also you said, you're not advocating to go back to the feudal system. Like what? So if say like America went back to the pre-Civil War, how again like it was pretty much on consent and you had the right to succeed. Would that be the system that you would want to go towards, or what would you like? What are the steps that you would want to go, or think that we should go towards more so? If it's not going to be like the Middle Ages exactly, what
Mhm.
would it be like, or what's the, I guess, somewhat of a concept?
Like, are you asking me what I think realistically would be a
Yeah, like
good push?
realistically, like what should, yeah, like what do you think
I
we
think,
should do or go towards?
yeah, I think any movement towards decentralization is the best single focus that would bring the best benefits and allow the most self-government. So the less power to the federal government, the more power to the states. But at the same time, the states are the population. They're so diverse. They're so large that they're not really the colonist in the when we were a union where everyone was more of a united whole. So I think you really need to break it down even lower into like the county level and the town level, just giving more power back to local level people, allowing to make their decisions. I think is what I'd like to see America. That may realistically happen. People start saying, you know, I don't want to fight with California. I want Californians to be the way they are, and I want Floridians to be the way they are, and let them make their decisions and break it down even more and more as much as possible.
Would you still have like a king under that system, or would it be a president then still?
I mean, it could be a president. My preferred system would have a king who would basically do nothing. He'd be there to ensure no one else has the power. Everything would be completely decentralized, autonomous into these towns and counties, and they'd all be self-governing as they want to be.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Well,
so
what
there
do you
wouldn't be a central power at all. I don't think centralized power is good. It just takes away self-government, only for military and dealing with diplomacy, international, and trade. But at the
mhm.
same time, I don't think that should be fully done centralized as well.
What do you think about constitutional republics, or is it just some, or is that even itself something that you wouldn't want to do?
I no, I like there's a lot I like about the original constitutional republic and the Articles of Confederation. I just think it brings in the possibility for negatives that are not needed. But and the hard thing is keeping people who want power are going to get into the places of power. Those are going to be the politicians, and they're not going to really play nice. You need something outside of a federal government that was a check, which we used to have with the union. But eventually, the federal government, like it did in America, is going to get too
Yeah.
powerful, and it's going to overtake those states. And that's why Thomas Jefferson said, "You need a revolution every once in a while." And I think every government over time is going to become more authoritarian, become more corrupt, and against what it was originally intended to do. And the people need to take back their self government. And I think America is past that time.
Did the Articles of Confederation, did they advocate for a monarch?
No, no, they
Oh,
were
okay.
they were much like the constitutional republic. In my book on the Civil War, I mentioned how George Washington, Madison, a couple other founders referred to the Constitution as the Second Confederacy. We were known as the Confederate States of America under the Articles of Confederation, and so they'd refer to us under the Constitution as the New Confederacy. not everyone did, but some of them did. And there is, I say, in the Constitution, even it refers to us as a confederacy, almost as if it's an extension of the Articles of Confederation. But it was centralizing power under the Constitution compared to the Articles of Confederation. So, I mean,
Okay.
there's things to like in both. The Articles of Confederation were probably more to my liking because it really limited central ability to do anything without nearly unanimous consent.
Yeah, because it seems like if this vision of a monarchy, it seems even you look at Europe, it seems so out of reach, and I don't mean to to mock you at all or try to
Mm,
point anything negative, where it's too it seems like it would be such a big change for somebody to
right.
for a nation, let alone a town to just go about this movement where you would move from again, this federalization that it seems like the only way that it would happen, and you mentioned, the revolution or a revolution would have to take
Mm,
place and or big change, or maybe like a catastrophe happens where it would
mm,
just be such a devastation where just by default or de facto of that happening,
mm.
a new government would rise up because the old one would just unfortunately be such at a devastating loss.
Yeah, no, I agree. My book
I think I
is
mentioned
not
that right.
really like a pathway of here's the way we should
Yeah.
go. It's more of we've gotten some things wrong about history that I'd like to correct in people's mind and point out that it wasn't the dark ages as people think, and that I think it's actually much preferable to our modern system, that we don't democracy is not as great as people think. As far as getting out of the place that we're in, I don't really, I don't myself have hope for it, especially in America. We're so anti any idea of a monarch or a king, or going, the more conservative sections really kind of worship the founding fathers and a lot of what they did, and they see it as the ideal form of system of government, as I did. So breaking them from that is not going to happen, and the other side is not going to be very favorable. They're more collectivist minded. To me, I was on a podcast last week, and we were talking about California. Especially
Mm.
with Trump in control and the Supreme Court and Congress being Republican, that hopefully that could ignite them to seek secession. I don't know. Trump might be the one that would let them
I was
out.
gonna ask you what you think about Trump actually. Because
It's
he's been doing really great these last 2 weeks and going hard, and I hope he does go hard because, like, he has nothing to lose at this point, like, he has
right.
no
Yeah, that's what I
momentum.
said.
So I really just
They've
hope
tried
that
to
he can,
kill him. They've tried everything, and
put
he
that
can't
pedal
be
to the
elected
floor.
again. He doesn't care anymore. So yeah, he could get
Yeah,
up and
and,
done.
like, day 1, like, he had some I loved how he registered cartels as a terrorist group. I was like,
Yeah,
"Yeah,
that was brilliant. I think.
like, awesome," emergency at the border. So what do you think about Trump? Does it give you some kind of, hope for capitalism and slash, slash, or, like, I know you call it democracy, but, slash America?
I it's gonna be. I stopped watching the news. I stopped being involved in politics, and now that Trump's back in, it's like I'm interested. So I do want to see what happens, because I'm like, for once in the last 20, 30 years, I feel like actual change could happen. But at the same time, the system is too far gone for me. Even if someone were to implement things that I like, they're forcing it on the other half, who's going to fight back and win in 4 years anyway. And it's going to end up in the political battle. The one thing I somewhat hope for is that California does, Trump upsets them so much that they do leave, and that he allows it. And I think that'll ignite other places to do the same. And then all the liberals are going to be able to move to California and live how they want. The conservatives, they're going to escape out and go to Texas. And I think it's going to lead more to that Middle Ages decentralized of people living how they want to live.
I might have missed that combo. So, is there a combo or conversation happening where California is saying that they want to succeed?
Yeah, there's a movement.
Hmm.
I forget the name of it, but I mean, it's been around for a couple of decades, but it's really picked up steam as of late. Same with the Texas movement for Texas to leave the
Yeah, they
union.
always been talking about it leaving,
Yeah,
which at this
and
point
and
was
I've heard. I think it's Colorado. There's a movement to split in Colorado, and some counties in Illinois, I believe it is, want to leave because they're saying Chicago's controlling them, and we're more like I think it's Indiana or Ohio, they want to join the other state. And so any sort of movements like that that I see, I get excited about. And
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that would, because when you hear that that word succession, that puts a lot of fears in a lot of people's minds. I
mhm,
wonder if that would even be possible under this. I mean, what Trump allowed, as you said. I mean, who knows? Maybe he would, but then he's also talking about, hey, Canada, should join, America, become,
yeah,
which which is funny and huge. That would be a huge change. Like, come on in.
yeah.
And then
Why
we're all
would
the liberals going to run because the liberals are like, well, I'm going to leave, go to Canada if
go to
Trump gets in
Canada?
office. Well, hey,
Yeah,
surprise.
yeah.
So who
That
knows
would
where
push
that happens.
everything left too if Canada joined. So I don't. I think Trump says a lot. I think he's a negotiator, and I think his talk about Greenland and stuff. He's kind of starting, from what I'm told. When you're negotiating, you want to go hard and you want to go strong on your end, and you'll end up at a more favorable position. I think he's a great negotiator. And I think that's a lot of what his language and thing he's doing. He's seen, I'm coming back to a president, I'm negotiating, I'm throwing out some kind of crazy stuff that I know won't happen, but it's going to give me more towards what I want in the end. And so I
I know.
see him doing some of that.
Yeah, because it does seem to be a shift in the young people too, where they have realized that, like, this wokeness is garbage.
Hmm.
Let's stop hating ourselves because we're America. Let's love
Hmm.
America. And I'm hoping that Trump does a good 4 years and we get somebody else in the next 4 years.
Hmm.
And it almost seems like to me too. It's like, well, let's say Trump does do really good because he's off to a great start, and I'm hoping he
Hmm.
does really good. In another 4 years, we have another election. Are people really going to go back to a Joe Biden? And I'm
Right.
starting to really doubt that. Honestly, I'm like, are they really going to just go back to another? Let's even say, like, somebody better than Joe Biden, runs for office. I mean, but who's the best pick? Like Gavin Newsom, or it's kind of like, you really want to be like
Right.
California? So I'm hoping, who knows, God knows, honestly, what's going to come of America. But it seems like we could get back, hopefully, to a better pace where we could go away from this. Again, like, let's just teaching our kids to hate America, where
Yeah.
people are just going to be like sick of it. Like, no, I want let's love America and do good for ourselves, and hopefully we can be a better nation.
I think, that's part of why I'm excited just to see what happens, because I think Trump is a bit of an outsider. He's not a normal politician, and he kind of does what he wants. And that's why I think, some big changes could actually happen. One thing I'm specifically hoping for is the school choice. I've always despised government education. And so the more school choice there is, where the parents get to decide where the kids go, to me, that can change the whole mindset of people across the nation, and that would be the biggest change in my view. That's what I hope for, that he implements. But I think the
Yeah.
Democrats are in a really tough spot. I think I was watching, I think it was CNN, the election night, and I think they really just started to notice that all their tactics of trying to divide people and claiming everyone's racist, we're not doing, whatever they want them to do, is not working anymore, and that people are more open-minded. I think more people are watching podcasts like yours, and they're not watching mainstream media,
Hmm.
and they're really exposing themselves on the left. And I think they have to do some serious rethinking, reevaluation of what they stand for, or they could be in a lot of trouble. And if 4 years from now, say Vance or another conservative gets elected, California may say, we're not doing this again, and leave. And think of all those representatives that are going to be out, all the liberal House of Representatives that would be gone if California did leave, and where they have 56 electoral points or whatever, which would be a huge conservative shift across the rest of America, were California to
Yeah.
leave the union or the
Yeah.
nation.
Yeah, because if you look at the media, it really has been decentralized. Where now it's, I mean,
Mhm.
like, Joe Rogan podcast is
Right.
really, I believe, played a huge part in
Mhm.
winning this election for Trump. And the media has lost its power, and they know it too. Like, their views are sinking. Like, you get podcast again, like Joe Rogan, he gets more views than CNN.
Yeah.
Thank God he does, honestly.
Yeah.
And so it really, that's a really good one. And then Trump's talking about getting rid of the income tax and doing more tariffs. So hopefully, we can have that system. And I do agree with you, by the way, too, because one of the things that I like how you point out, where I found that I do have agreement with libertarians, a lot. I do believe that the education should be the household and then the church, and in that order. So
Mhm.
parents teaching their kids,
Right.
and then the church educating them. I'm not talking about so much like the liberal churches, or not even talking about liberal churches where they want to place this big emphasis on youth group, and then come to find out the youth group leaders teaching them something
Yeah.
about social justice. But I mean,
Yeah.
like true biblical Christianity, where we can focus on that first, because I do believe there is and they know this too of the liberals, and they play the long game on this, on tearing
Right.
down the nuclear family. They see the benefits of indoctrination, which I
Mhm.
like how you do point out how that's one of the negatives of democracy, where they realize, okay, it's a voting game. Well, how do I win this voting game? Oh, by owning the youth. And so let's indoctrinate them. Let's put them in
Right.
public schools. And so if we can decentralize now, just like how there's been a decentralization of the media, let's decentralize
Mhm.
public education, bring back homeschooling. And thankfully that's been up since 2020. And then we get our churches preaching
Mhm.
biblical scriptural Christianity. Well, I mean, that overflows into a much better nation,
Right.
and hopefully a
Right.
Christian nation by God's grace.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think everything derives from education, and that's why I use in my intro. I talk about how I was a liberal and I was a atheist, and then I became a conservative Christian, and then a libertarian, and then kingship, because my education, I'd learned other viewpoints, and I'd been educated in ways that the normal person does not have access to, and so the more of that, the
Yeah.
better. I think it.
Would you say that you did, how much study did you do before you wrote this book? Like, have you been studying this for 5 years, or has it been longer than that?
Um, in a way I'd say probably 10 years because I actually started researching a book I wrote for J.R. Tolkien, and I delved into a lot of Anglo-Saxon works. I wanted to
You wrote
find
a
out
book for
what.
Tolkien, you said? Was that what you said?
Yeah, yeah, on J.R. Tolkien, it's called "The
Oh,
Road Goes Ever On and On," and so I wanted to dig into the material that affected his worldview and how he created Middle Earth. And as I started doing that, I went through all the Anglo-Saxon history, and I started realizing, hey, this is
mm,
nothing like I thought. And that was maybe 4 years or so, and it expanded into all the Middle Ages. And I really focused down on this book in particular 4 or 5 years, but I have that ability to hyper focus. Like I went through Fordham University's entire library, and they have one of the largest manuscripts, medieval history in the world. And I went through all that during COVID. I had, as out of work, I wasn't able to work. I had a lot of time, and I just full went in. I can read 300 books a year and take notes, and the whole time I'm
read
writing and
300
thinking about
books?
it. What's
Is that
that?
did you read 300 books, or that's just
Like
like a
300 books a year was probably the average, and then you add in all the original sources and the writing. It was quite a bit of work that I went full into, but I'd say
wow.
it expanded probably a 10-year period, probably 4 or 5 really, really just completely focused in on it.
Did you actually read 300 books, you said?
Like
Or
a year, I mean,
that's a
I'd have to
lot.
guess. That's a guess of it was about 300 a year.
Wow,
And
that's a
and,
lot.
the whole time I'm taking notes and citations
Yeah.
and then throwing it all together. That was
Mm.
for, maybe 3 or 4-year period where I really put into the Middle Ages.
Wow, that's awesome. I mean, because I try to read as much as I can. I work full time
Yeah.
too, but
Well, yeah, but that's the thing when I
but even
dedicate,
so, that's
50,
dedication.
55 hours a week to just reading and taking notes. And I was in a situation where I was able to do that and, homeschool on the
Wow.
side, so
That's awesome. Yeah, because my wife gets mad at me of how much books I order.
Yeah,
Man, I would love to just read 300 books a year. I mean,
yeah,
because I absolutely love to read, and I'm a
yeah.
pretty, to my knowledge, a big reader. But if you're doing 300, I'm like an amateur.
Yeah. I since learned I think it has to do with ADHD. I have ADHD, and there's something called hyperfocus where it's considered like, something that a lot of people can't do. Like they can't focus on one subject for so long, where I
Mm,
can do it hours of intense research and just, love it, not get fatigued and things like that. And I could just
yeah.
get a lot done in a short amount of time.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, hey, thanks for coming on. Is there any final words you want to give to our audience, Jeb?
I want to thank you one more time for having me on. To the audience, if you're interested in the Middle Ages or Christian form of government compared to secular, I think you'd learn a lot from my book. I'd love to have any feedback or questions if anyone does pick up the book, but I think there's a lot of information there, a lot of ideas that people aren't used to hearing.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting book, and it gets you thinking on a lot of topics too. And so I love books that can get me thinking, and yours definitely did that. I'll leave the description in the link of this video. Again, it's Missing Monarchy by Jeb Smith. It's on Amazon. You can purchase it there. Jeb, thanks again for so much, for tuning in and spending time with us. To the audience, hit the like button. Helps the algorithm push the video out. Share this video if you can. Subscribe if you haven't. And thanks again for tuning in. We're signing off. It's been another episode of Method Ministries. Take care and God bless.